Hello everyone. So in the last video, we developed a solution, the web application itself, that tries to mimic the behavior from a tiny URL. So essentially, just to do a small refreshment, so let me just try to explain you what the tiny URL does. So the tiny URLs takes the long URL that you have, and what it does, it actually creates a bit smaller URL. So for instance, if for some reason we want to see the new corona numbers, we can just paste the link and write here some weird shorter URL, and then we can essentially access this URL, this long link using this short URL. And exactly the same thing we have developed in the application itself. Let me just find it for a second. So this is our test MVC web application. So if I just run this application, we're going to get exactly the same behavior. So I will just paste now exactly the same link. Actually, I'm pasting the tiny URL. Okay, that's actually even cooler. So I'm just going to click run, and it will tell me, okay, you can access the link here. And then this is going to refresh us to the tiny URL and tiny URL to the YouTube, which is quite okay. Perfect. So we have created successfully a solution. Solution works, but the problem is we have developed a solution from the perspective of a junior developer. When saying we develop it from the perspective of a junior developer, this means that we have built a lot of our code in in a method, so we give too much responsibility to the specific method. For instance, if you look at the post method of the index action of the home controller, you will see that this method is responsible for a couple of things. So it generates a random string, it tries to build map URL, search for the data in the file system, so it actually reads the file itself, it deserializes, it does really a lot of things, and then at the end of the day it writes everything back to the file, and it's just a bit of an overwhelming set of actions for one single method. Aside of this, this method is quite difficult to test, because every time if we want to test the index method, we will end up in file creation. So even if we maybe don't even have an access to read to a certain file location, we will get the system exception and our test is going to fail. So the running of the test of this index method will essentially represent an integration test rather than a unit test, which we want to do in this particular case. So the whole purpose of this video is to refactor this code a bit and to write it in a form of someone who is a senior developer. So in order to do this, we're going to do a complete refactoring of those two actions, so two methods, and we're going to add a bit more libraries. We're going to explain a bit of a test, the way how we write a test with arrange, act, assert methods, yeah. Then essentially let's just start. So if I just look at this post method, I see that it's responsible, as I said already, for a couple of things. So what I want to do now is I want to see this method and see the complete this MVC project as a simple interface. So we're just going to use it to call a certain business logic layer, which is going to do all this processing and all this data saving. And it will just return us the result. So this is going to give us a couple of features and a couple of possibilities for the future. So we will be able to reuse exactly the same logic for maybe some mobile application or some web APIs or whatever we want to do. So let's essentially start. So in order to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a certain class, and I'm just going to call it here something like Minify processor. And let me just make it public. And I will have here two methods. One method is going to be something like a process. The other one would be to resolve. So let me just write here public. I'm just going to put an object for now, and I will say process, and I'm going to pass as a parameter something which is string, and this is going to be a URL. And the another one will be going to again set it as public, and it's going to be again object, and it's going to be resolve, and we can say string ID, something like this, because this is going to be this short code that we're using to essentially find the correct object inside a database. So the question now is, what kind of objects what kind of models do we actually expect to be returned from this, from the process and from the resolve methods? So from the process itself, we are expecting to receive a certain ID. So essentially the shortened version of that link. And it would be quite simple model, and we can go ahead and create one more library here. And it's going to be a class library, and in the class library we're going to keep all of our models. I'm just naming this project quite simple so that everyone can really understand what is happening there. So let me just delete this one, and I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call it Minify model, something like this. I'm going to again make this class public, and here I'm going to have something which is essentially the minified URL, and it's going to be a type of string, and I'm just going to name it sorry, minified URL. So we have our getters and setters. So this already looks quite okay. So Minify processor here would expect, let me just add a reference to our model project quickly. Great. And now here, what I do expect is minifier model. Great. And the minifier model will not be, I believe, sufficient enough to manage the resolve option itself. So essentially, in order to manage the in order to manage the resolve, we will need to have a bit different model, and then this model would essentially need to have the ID from the minifier model, but also it will have the complete URL where we would redirect the user. So let's just create a new class which is going to be called something, URL mapper, for instance. And we're going to do the same thing. Let's just make it public, and here we will have public string, and let's just make it URL. We have our getters and setters, and again, I missed it in this. We have another string which is a type of ID. Great. And now we are going to let's just make public URL mapper, and here we're going to have string ID and string URL. So our constructor is being built, and we say ID is going to be ID and URL is going to be URL. Simple. So now let's go back to our Minify processor, and here we will have URL mapper. Perfect. So our methods are red because obviously we're not returning any values here, but what we know at the moment is that those are only two methods that are going to exist in a Minify processor. So what I can do is I can just extract using ReSharper in my case. I'm just going to extract the interface, and I'm going to put in its own file both of those methods, and I'm just going to click next, and there they're going to be. So it is quite simple, I believe, to understand the complete interface, and essentially this interface could be afterwards used to mock the data and essentially to simulate the action from this Minify processor. I'm going to explain this at a later phase. So now when we're looking in the Minify process, so let me just do here throw new not implemented exception, just so that we know if we want to call this one, it will not work. And for the process one, we have to think about it a bit, what is happening here. So what we want to do is we want to call for the URL something that we already did in the home controller. From what we want to do, we essentially want to build this small URL. So essentially we need to build this key here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add one more class which is going to be responsible only for this. So it's going to be like a manager who is going to do a validation of the URL, and it will return back the minimized, so essentially our code for that given URL. So let's just create a new class here, and we're going to call it URL minifier. Yeah, great. And I'm going to make it public. And one thing that I will do here, I'm going to have to build, obviously, well, I can do interface immediately, but let me just write it right here. So method is going to return minifier model, which we already have, and I'm just going to call it minify. Here we have a string, and it's going to be the URL. Now what I'm going to do, the first thing is I'm going to validate the string. This is what we said that we have to do. And let's see, just 1 second. What seems to be the problem? If URI, let's see, is well formatted URL string, and we're going to pass a URL. So if it is not, essentially what we will say here, we can throw the exception, which is not something that you actually should do. Let me just see, why does it complain? We're actually missing the kind of the URL. Great. So what we can do, we can throw the exception, but the problem is the exceptions in .NET are a bit expensive. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go to the Minify model, and I can do one thing, which is essentially adding a couple of more fields here that would say, was the processing successful or not? But I can actually do something maybe a bit better. So I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call it processing response. Come on. And let me just make it public. And here we will have Boolean type is completed. And the another one is going to be of a type string, and it's going to be called message. Great. So now our minified model can have a processing response, which essentially means that every time when we can even have here a bit of a constructor, and here I'm going to say Boolean is success, and I'm going to say string message, and yeah, let's also go. Actually, we don't even need minified URL, because if the value is not successful, then obviously we will not be able to essentially build the URL. So if the URL is not complete, so let me just here build a constructor, and I'm going to say here bool is completed, string message, and let's see, I'm just going to say is completed equals is completed, and message is message. So here what I can do now, I can say base, and I can pass its success, and I can pass a message. So our constructor is going to work completely fine, and I can go now to my URL minifier and say if the URL is not well formatted, I can say return new minify model, and I'm going to say false and send the message URL is not well formatted. Perfect. So what I did here, I managed the exception in the code, which means that we don't need really to host any super expensive .NET operations. So the next thing would be to build a minified URL, and we already did this in a home view model. Oops, not home view model, home controller. And we did something like this. So we said randomizer generate random string, and this is something that we're going to do now. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to use a bit better names like minified URL is going to be randomizer, and I'm going to say generate random string. 5 is completely fine. So let me just name it something like var minified model is a new minified model, and here I already have a constructor with a success and a message. I just want to expand it a bit, and I'm going to just put those two values, and I'm going to put minified URL, and still in the base we're going to pass this success and message, but here we're going to say minified URL is minified URL. Perfect. So this is the really, I think, a model that is going to satisfy all of our needs. So we say the success is true, message is going to be string empty, and the minified URL is going to be a minified URL. Great. So the only thing that we need to do is we need to return, let me fix the typo, minified model and minified model. This would be a bit better. Great. So we have our minified model, we have our method, and what I do now is I usually extract the interface at this point. So I don't know, maybe a bit more senior people than me would do this at the beginning. So now, as we have our URL minifier, next thing would be to include the URL minifier inside a Minify processor. And how do we do this? So we'll just go to Minify processor, and I'm going to say constructor, and here I'm going to just inject a URL minifier. So I'm just going to introduce read-only. Sorry, I'm just going to include read-only property minifier, and already with this abstraction, I can say minifier that minify URL, and this is going to return me a certain result, var result, and in a case that result was not completed, I will return just the result as is. So this is going to be sufficient for me to essentially write a message to the user saying, hey, you know, URL was not correct, or something else happened. However, the next step would be to build a data layer, so database data access layer, which is going to be used to save this information inside the database itself. So how do we do this? So I'm just going to add a new project here, and this new project is going to be again a class library, and I'm just going to go on the next, and I'm going to call it data adapter, something like this, and I'm going to click on next. So what am I going to do now is I'm going to implement in this data adapter abstraction of the data operations that I want to utilize. So instead of going with a class here, I'm going to add an interface. So let's say new item and interface, and I'm going to call this guy data adapter. And I'm going to do a typo as often, and now it's going to be a bit better. So I'm going to make this interface public. And let me just think for a second. So here in this data adapter, I would usually have a couple of operations. So it would be like create, insert, delete, update, those kind of things. But in this particular scenario, I will not delete my records inside the database. The only two operations that I need here are create and read. So that's it. And I can think about it in a way that I will try to essentially build this as abstract as possible. So what I want to do is I want to have generic methods that are going to work with a certain type of a model. So I know for a fact that my URL mapper here has the ID as a key. So what I can do here, in the models, I can create a new interface, which is going to be called like iBase model. And this is going to be actually public interface. And here I can say like this, exactly this. Perfect. And now URL mapper could be of a type iBase model, which means that in my data adapter here, what I can say is, I can say I will create a create method for type T, where T is going to be a model and where this T is type of iBase model. However, I should add like a reference to the models in order to give a Visual Studio a chance to use this namespace. Great. And the another one would be tget, where I would, for certain string, which is ID, return a T, which is going to be a base model. Perfect. So this is exactly what I need for my data adapter. And now in my business layer, I would add a reference to the data adapter. And inside the Minify processor, I can also include now data adapter. Great. And this data adapter, I will just introduce this guy. And now what I can say is data adapter dot create, and I can pass a result. Is this a Minify model? Let me just see for a second. So what did we use here? Here we use the Minified model. Okay, so essentially the Minify model has everything that I want. So I can just go ahead here and say create a new, new URL mapper. And here I'm just going to say result dot minified URL, and the URL is the value that I want to save. And that is essentially it. So I really don't need to do anything else. And I can just here say return result, which is going to return the Minify model, which was processed already by Minify processor. So why is this pretty good? It is good because the data adapter that we're calling here is not even implemented. We have absolutely no idea what it is. Neither does processor has any concrete implementation of this data adapter. So data adapter can be anything what we implement. It can be a text data adapter, it can be SQL data adapter, literally whatever we want, CSV files, whatever it is, whatever we find appropriate. So if we just run the build, hopefully our code is going to be buildable. At the moment, yes, it seems so. So right now we can start thinking about the data adapter itself, and we can essentially build the first data adapter that we want, and this would be our text data adapter. So let's go ahead and let's add our data adapter. And to do this, we're going to, I believe it's quite okay to structure this a bit. So I'm just going to add a new folder here, and I'm going to call this file storage, something like this. And I'm going to add a new class, which is going to be called file storage data adapter. Great. And then this is going to be a public, obviously, and I'm going to say that this is a type of iData adapter. And already Visual Studio is complaining a bit, so I'm just going to implement the missing members, which are two of the members that I have. One is a create and one is the get. So one thing that I already know that I have, if I want to work with the files, is a file name. So I really don't want to inject the file name right now. I'm just going to put it here as a constant. So I'm just going to say string file name would be, and I already have this file name inside the home controller. So let me just go here. I have it already. I could copy a bit more, but it doesn't matter. We have it right now. So what do? We do exactly the same thing as we already had in the previous project. The only thing this time, I'm going to think ahead and I'm going to install the newtons of JSON. So let me just go ahead and manage the packet on the solution level. So here I'm just going to add it on the data adapter layers. So I'm just going to add it right here. And let me just maybe, for fun, let me just go ahead and copy paste certain things from the home controller. So I have this this data here, but maybe it would be actually better to do it because I'm working here with the generic. So so I will say here var existing data would be file that read all text of the file name. So file path would be actually maybe a bit better name. So something, come on, something like this. Okay. And now I would say var converted data would be JSON convert would be deserialized object of so same as before, we're expecting list, but this time we're expecting a list of a T. And oopsie, this made a bit of a mess. And here I'm going to just pass the existing data that we already got. And if none of this data exists, I'm just going to return a new list. So something like this. And now I can say, okay, converted data that add data. Sorry, model, not data, just a model that we have here. And the next thing, let me just delete this one. I can say file, write all text. And again, we say file path. And let me now do JSON convert that serialized object, and I'm passing converted data. That's it. We have successfully implemented our creation of the file storage, working hopefully completely fine. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to implement a get, and we're using our base model with the ID, and the base model has the ID. We're essentially able to filter out certain things here. So let me just go ahead and say, okay, we can copy paste this thing. So this is always the same. And we can copy paste this one. So we already see that we can extract this to a specific method. So let's just do this. So we can say private list of T get file contents, and we can just do it like this. Oh, sorry, let's say where T would be of a type I-base model. Okay, private list T get file contents. I'm just missing this one. Okay, great. So now I can actually do this. I can just copy paste it here, and I can say return converted data. And now here I can say var converted data would be equal to get file contents. I don't even hopefully need this. That is correct. Or maybe not. T. And the another one would be, well, exactly the same. And now what I can do here is I can say var result would be converted data at single or default where ID equals ID, which I have as a parameters. So now I can just say, return result. That's it. So if it is null, it will return null. If none, then it will return a value that I really need to fulfill the requirements of this file storage. So let me just build the solution quickly. Okay, build has been successful. And the only thing that remains is essentially connect the dots that we have and clean up a bit the web project. So let me just go ahead quickly to the web project here, and I'm going to just check references quickly because I might missing something. So I'm just going to add models here as well because I will need it. And for this post action, so essentially I will need just the basic things. So I will also inject here the implementation of what was it? Minify processor, I believe. Yes. Let me just close this guy. So let's call it a Minify processor and introduce this read-only property. Great. We don't need this file path anymore, so this is fine. So we will not need any of those values here. The only thing that I will now use is this Minify processor. So let me just so if I just quickly go ahead to the Minify processor, I will see that I have two things, process and resolve. So in this case here, I'm just going to hopefully be able to call resolve, and the other one here would be to process. So let me just go with the process. So first line, I don't need it. I'm doing everything there. Same thing here, same thing here. Mapped URLs, I don't need any of this, any of this, any of this. So essentially the only thing what I would need is a view model lines here. So I'm just going to say process view model that URL to short. That's it. And I'm going to have var result is this, and then result that unified URL. Perfect. That is essentially it. And I can even use the flag from the result, the one which is successful. If we just go ahead quickly and for the process one, we have a minifier model, and in the processing response, we have is completed and we have a message, and those values here can be used to give additional explanation to the users, you know, what went wrong, if anything went wrong, which is quite okay. So we can just quickly just check the view model, and we can say here like string error message. We can have this here, and can just do something in the home controller here, and I can tell him something like view model that error message equals result that message. Perfect. So, and already when I have this, I can just quickly go ahead here, and I can say in another div, if I really want it like this, I can say if same thing as I had here, string is null or empty model that error message. So if it's not null or empty, I will just go ahead and do, oopsie, something, I missed something. Okay. This. Okay. I can say here span something went wrong, and I can say model that error message. I can add some additional classes here to make it a bit more red or green or whatever I want, but essentially that should cover it. And inside this home controller, yet again, I really don't want to work with any of the file systems anymore. So I will just say Minify processor resolve U. That is it. And I will also have response for this one. And if response is not equals to null, then I'm going to say response. And what do I have here? Do I have URL? Yes, I do. So that's it. So now my code here looks way nicer, and it really does exactly what I want. It is really just an interface that I'm calling that I'm using to call the business logic, and then this business logic I can essentially call either from web API or from some I don't know, mobile application, Windows application, whatever I want. I can just use this business logic and I can just call it, and it will do everything that I want. Unfortunately, what will happen right now is if I run this thing, I will get the exception. So let me just go ahead and do this. I'm expecting to get an exception. Yes, because what the MVC is trying to do now, he's trying to resolve the Minify processor with a concrete implementation. So nowhere in the project we're telling him what to use to manage the Minify processor. So he has absolutely no idea that we should use this one. So let's do this. Let's create registration for the given interface. So let's just do it. So the only thing that we need is to go to startup CS, and in the startup CS we have a method here which is called configure services. So what we can do here is we can just say services that add scoped, and let's say for Minify processor I'm going to use a Minify processor. Great. So I have told the MVC, okay, please, every time when you see Minify processor, please use my Minify processor. And now if I just quickly go ahead to Minify processor, I see that I have URL minifier and a data adapter. So now for, oopsie, let me just stop the execution of this one. So for services add scoped, I forgot what was the name, URL minifier, I'm going to use URL minifier. And also now services add scoped for database adapter, I'm going to use file storage data adapter. So it's quite simple. So now he knows all the implementation, and essentially if I would have a different data adapter, I could just switch it right here and it would just work with another data adapter. So let me just try again. Let me just go ahead and run this project and let's see, will I get any exceptions? Hope not. Great. So we have our application running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say HTTP let me just do google.com. Simple. And let me just run and say you can access your link via this URL. So hopefully this created a value, and we don't have our resolve method yet implemented. Okay, but this should not be quite difficult, I believe. So the only thing what we would need to do here, we would essentially say var result would be data adapter that get, and I would say for data adapter we are using essentially a URL mapper, right? And I would say URL mapper, and I would just pass the ID here, and this is exactly what we need, and I can just say return result. That's it. So it should be working as expected. So let me just go ahead and click the run and let's see, is it going to work now? So google.com, you can access your link using this one. Let me just go ahead and run this one. So it seems that it's working as expected. I'm pretty happy with this. So we can say that our application is running very much as expected. One thing that we didn't really cover so far in this frenzy was a test. Not even a single test we actually did. And I just want to show you quickly, how to write a tests using the mock framework. And especially I would like to test a simple method for this data adapter. So let me just go ahead in the unit tests, and I'm going to manage the NuGet package as soon as I stop the execution of the project. and I'm going to go ahead and say and substitute. And I'm going to install it, and I'm going to accept a lot of things, some licenses, all good. And one more thing that I really use is shortly. This is a pretty good and fluent way of asserting your statements. So I really much enjoy working with this library. Let it just wait for a second. It is frozen for some reason. Okay, so let me just stop the video, and then I will come back to you as soon as this is fixed. Okay, so I hope that all the packages got successfully added to my project, so it seems so. And what I want to do now is I would like to add one test which is going to test a Minify processor. And to do this, again, I have a bit of a problems again with the studio. Okay, now it gets better. So what I want to do now is I'm going to add a new class here, and I'm just going to call it Minify processor tests. Great. And I'm going to just say that this is public, and I'm going to add attribute test class so that Studio knows how to recognize it. So here, if I just quickly on the Minify processor, I will notice a couple of things. So a couple of things is I'm depending on the URL minifier and a data adapter. So what I actually need to do in my test as well is I would have those guys as well. I'm just not going to make them read-only. I will just make them standard ones. So let me just import those two types, and I have them here. I also obviously need to have Minify processor, and I'm just going to call it Minify processor. Great. Yeah, so I will now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize those values. And this, when writing a test, there are some dedicated attributes that you can use to do exactly this. I'm just going to make initialize method, public quote initialized, and I'm going to say test initialized. And here I'm going to do something quite cool. So I'm going to say that data adapter is going to be a substitute. I'm going to use substitute for data adapter, right? So why is this interesting? So it means that actually I'm not going to use any of concrete implementations, any concrete implementation that I did for the data adapter, in this case file reader. So I'm going to create a test now, and I'm going to call it valid URL should be saved to the database, right? Something like this. And I'm going to say that this is a test method. Great. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say minifier. So actually for the minifier, I can even say that this is a valid one. So I can the real implementation. So I can say minifier is new URL minifier, something like this. So let me just see how the new URL minifier looks like. Quite simple, nothing much. We're just doing here a bit of a validation. So this is something that should be covered in a test of the URL minifier, but this is something that I'm not going to do right now. So what I'm going to tell him is he is going to, I need to make it a void. I'm going to give him a valid URL. So I'm going to just quickly, I can even say here, private string valid URL is going to be something like HTTPS. Why shouldn't I, for instance, just copy this? It would make my life way easier. Great. So now when I have a valid URL, I can essentially utilize this in a Minify processor. So I will say Minify processor equals new Minify processor, and I'm going to pass him a minifier, and I'm going to pass him a data adapter. Now this is quite cool, because the data adapter that I'm going to use is not going to do actually anything. So what I can say is, I can say var result would be Minify processor, and I will say process, and I'm going to pass him a valid URL. And now this is called arrange, so I'm actually arranging everything, and now I did an act. So act essentially means I called a function or a method which I want to test, and I got my result which I want to test. And now what I want to see is that first of all, result is completed should be true. So you see, this is what Shogli is giving you. Essentially, it gives you a bit more fluent way of testing this. And I can say also result minified URL should not be string empty. Something like this, just a test. But the big thing is now, so I want to see, did my data adapter save anything? And how do I do this? Well, I can just say data adapter, did you received, you should receive one call. So let me just go ahead to Minify processor here. So the data adapter should run this call, which is a create, right? He must run this call. So let me just go ahead here, and I'm going to tell him, hey, you know what? You should have received one call for the create operation, and I'm just going to say for argument of any I-base model. For any of I-base models, because we are inheriting I-base model inside of the URL mapper, so it is a type of I-base model. So essentially here, I can test, is this call being executed? And what I want to do, I actually want to go in a debug mode, and I want to run you through how this is working, and will my test be successful or not. So if I just go ahead and hover over data adapter, you will see that it's actually a substitute. It's not real implementation. So if I go to Minify processor and to result here, it's processed. So let me just go ahead once more and result. So it did really everything what was expected. It's now going to run the create, but it didn't do anything. It didn't actually do anything. So he's like officially did everything, but now the exception is thrown because I just moved the breakpoint up and down. But what we can say is that it actually did. Let me just run it here. He actually did called once the create method of the I-base model, so it is successful here. You can find it. You can find it exactly there. So you can also do one more thing, and we can also simulate the case when we're not able to save data to the file, and this is something that I want to show you as well. And let me just quickly do this. So I'm just going to say one more public void failed save should be managed as failure, something like this. And I'm going to say that this is a test method, obviously. And now what I'm going to do again is I'm going to say data adapter when I'm doing create for any argument. So arg any I-base model. I will tell him do throw, come on, new exception, generic exception. Okay, it is a bit of a tricky thing to write, but it should be, I believe the syntax is something like this. So data adapter, when you call create method for any base argument, I'm expecting you to throw a new exception. So this is what I expect that you're going to do. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to essentially have the similar logic here. I'm just going to say, you know, Minify processor will be a new Minify. Let me just copy this one. When you're writing a test, it's not that terrible thing if you really do a bit of a copy pasting. And let me just say bar result. Well, I can do this again, and I can say now that result is completed should be false. And this is what I would expect. So in the case that I was not able to save the data to the file or to my database, I should have failed the execution. So let me run this and let's see. Okay, this is a fail. I have actually null reference exception. Okay, so let's see processor line 24. Let me just see this. Okay, Minify URL. Maybe I missed something. Okay, because I forgot to do this, but I can actually, let me just hide this. I can actually do something like this here, and then I would not have those problems. So let me just run it again. Failed again. Exception of the exception type was failed, throw the exception. Okay, failed should be managed as failure. Okay, but it wasn't. You know what happened? Okay, let me just run you through the debug mode. So essentially when the exception occurred, and it will occur here, it didn't went here, so it actually threw the exception outside of it. So we received the exception, but our result was not managed. So how do we do this? So essentially, let me just close this again. I'm just going to have a small try catch block here. And I'm going to say exception X. Here I can do, let's say some sort of a log of X. And I can say that result is completed is false. And I can say result message error while saving data to the database. Something like this. And now if I go back to my test, well, I can even do something like this, like a string interpolation, and say ax.message, something like this, just to provide a bit more data. Okay, let me run now the test, and now the test is green. So we have, using our test, we have extended the business logic, and we made it right. We recognize the value where it was right now. So this is essentially how you mock the values, and you can mock the responses as well. It is quite simple, but yeah, this is something that can be covered in one of the other sessions. But yeah, I think we have a completely working platform right now. So I will. Regarding this Minify, I will actually do one more thing in another video, and I will essentially build up the SQL Server database using Entity Framework Core, and this database itself is going to be using exactly the same data adapter that we have right now, and yeah, we'll just play around a bit with the SQL. So that's it for now. So thank you very much, and have fun. Bye bye.